This is Scott Richmond.
And Arnie Sherman.
You're listening to What Do You Know on Newstalk KGVO, AM 1290 and 98.3 FM. Good morning, Arnie Sherman.
Scott, how are you? You know, we had a great show last week. I'm not even waiting to see how you are because I'm feeling good.
You are?
And that's probably good enough.
Good.
Last week we had a great show with the mayor. Talked about lots of things. But this week we have a show that hits more of our personal sweet spot, right?
Our passions.
Our passions. We have Jeff Brandt, who teaches perhaps the most popular course at the University of Montana.
Yeah.
Which is the history of rock and roll.
Oh, God.
You know, and I mean, who wouldn't want to take that for credit, right, in college, given organic let's see, organic chemistry, vertebrate physiology, calculus, or the history of rock and roll? I don't know. No. So we have him here today, and rock and roll is an interesting topic. Some people think rock and roll is dead. Some people think it's not relevant anymore, or it's dormant. Lots of people commenting about what is the status of rock and roll and what's it been replaced by and what's going on in the music industry in general. So it'll be a very, I think, engaging conversation and discussion.
Well, I want to define rock and roll.
Yeah, what is rock and roll? I have some ideas about it. We'll talk with, I don't want to spoil our listeners to begin discussing it before he gets here. But what is the first rock and roll song you remember that that got your juices flowing?
Tutti Frutti, Little Richard.
Little Richard, yes.
You know, in the 70s, there was a whole 50s revival.
Right.
Right? And my brother had the LPs.
Yeah, well, that was, that's part of the roots of rock and roll. For me, it was Bobby Darin's Splish Splash. Do you remember that?
Yeah, of course.
Splish Splash, I was taking a bath.
Right.
About a Saturday night. Anyway, do you know what the genesis of that song was?
No, what was it?
It was written in 1958, interestingly enough, and it was a bet. It was written on a bet for Murray the K.
Yeah, Murray the K. Kaufman.
Murray the K. Kaufman, who was a big New York disc jockey, probably the biggest.
Yes.
If Alan Freed and Murray the K were the two biggest, guys.
Cleveland and New York.
Right, and he bet Bobby Darin he couldn't write a song that began with Splish Splash, I was taking a bath.
Great song.
And he wrote the song, and Murray helped him write the song.
Right.
But he couldn't use his name because it was going to be considered payola. Remember the whole payola scandals were going on, and he was the biggest disc jockey in the city. And the song, so he used his mother's name. So it's co-written by Jean Murray, Murray Kaufman's mother. And the song went to, I think, number 2 or 3 on the charts and really launched, Bobby Darin's career.
Yeah.
So that, and in that song, he alluded to some of the other figures from other hit rock and roll early age songs. Like there was one line that said that there was a party going on at his house, and he said Lollipop was there, Peggy Sue, and good golly, Miss Molly was even there too. Those were figures from
other songs,
other great songs by Chuck Berry and Jerry Lee Lewis and those guys. So I always found that to be an interesting. It was my first song where rock and roll hit. It was an East Coast song, and as you know, there was Southern rock and roll, and there was East Coast rock and roll, and there it was Philly rock, and eventually out to the West Coast. But I thought, thinking about the show today, what was the first song that got me into it? And it was Bobby Darin doing Splish Splash. So that's the history of that song. But there's a lot going on in the genesis of rock and roll, and Jeff hopefully will share with us some of the roots and some of the transition, and whether rock and roll has permanently morphed into alt rock or hard rock or whatever it's called now.
Hip hop is now considered rock.
And is rock and roll what we thought of rock and roll completely gone?
Well, if you look at the definition of rock and roll by the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, it paints a pretty broad picture, okay?
Right.
Because bands like Run DMC are in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Well, they're in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but they're not considered rock and roll performers. In fact,
right.
We'll ask Jeff, and maybe who is the hot rock and roll band now?
Right.
I mean, most of them are in their 70s, right? You got Allman Brothers coming back. I guess you would say they're rock and roll. Certainly the Stones.
Yeah.
They're all in their 70s.
Well, Old Cella. Think about who was at Old Cella. You had Bob Dylan, the Stones. You had Neil Young. and you had, I forget who else it was, but that was old cello, or Coachella.
Or was it, was Kiss a rock and roll band? I mean, they had a song, "We're going to rock and roll all night, right, and party every day."
Right.
So is Kiss one of the last of those? They're still performing. All these guys are still performing, keeping the roots of that, of that part of music alive. But is after them, is it over?
But let's ask ourselves this question, okay? Because we could think of rock as a style, which is what Kiss really did. They adapted the style of rock and roll to their music. They're not rock and roll kids, right? So
no.
Or was it an attitude, right? Because rock and roll to me has always been about attitude and rebelling against
Well, as
something.
somebody that was alive when the rock and roll began,
right?
I remember that it was teenagers, that it was a phenomenon of teenagers. And Japanese transistor radios were all the fad, with a little earplug so you could listen to the rock and roll music and not have your parents or anybody else criticize you for listening to it. Because it was considered by many the devil's music.
Right.
I mean, the word rock and roll came from a song about, sexual activity. That's the phrase was coined and had its roots in that, and it was considered, even before the Beatles were considered scruffy and off the main stage of things by adults.
Right.
Rock and roll, certainly. Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry and Little Richard and Bo Diddley and all those guys were scorned by mainstream as doing the devil's work. So it'll be interesting. I am actually very excited to talk to Jeff Brandt about where things are.
So we're going to be joined by Jeff Brandt from the University of Montana on What Do You Know, proudly supported by Don Maddox Glacier Sotheby's International Realty. Back after this with Jeff and some surprises. And we are back with a room full.
There's a room full of people here, but before we start with the professor and Shireen from Kiss.
Hello.
I had his student and protege. I alluded to Split Splash by Bobby Darin. I realized, I'm sort of ancient, and many of our listeners have no idea what I was talking about. So I thought I would give them a little snippet, and the way it sounded when I had my little transistor radio hooked up and the little earpiece.
The one earpiece
that they had in those $5 things to the beginning of Split Splash.
One, two, three. Splish splash, I was taking a bath. Long about a Saturday night. Yeah, rubbed up, just relaxing in the tub. Thinking everything was alright. Well, I stepped out the tub, I put my feet on the floor. I wrapped the towel around me and I opened the door. And in a splish splash, I jumped back in the bath. Well, how was I to know there was a party?
Arnie is getting down.
Well, that for our listeners is the beginning of rock and roll for me.
How could that be? How could there be any teen rebellion with that song, Jeff?
I think it comes down to the feel. I mean, first of all, it starts with the fact that you have rhythm and blues really developing parallel or alongside jump blues, which was basically a form of jazz that was sort of like a smaller jazz band. And what they called it was the big beat, where you were playing all four beats really like bumping,
right.
And that makes you want to move. And if you want to move, you want to dance. And if you want to dance, then that's a problem, because then, people get together, and when they get together,
pregnant,
you know what happens.
Yeah. And if you guys are just joining us too, Jeffrey Brandt, I'm one of his students. He's the history of rock and roll teacher at the University of Montana. I just want to say that I think that is such an important class for all students to take. Not only is it fun, but it's so informative too. I'm Shireen Herrera from 94.9 KISS FM, and I just wanted to join to intro on Professor Brandt here.
Maybe brown nose.
And
A+, please.
It's okay. I'll take it.
I think
that somehow in a weird way fits together with rock and roll.
it does. Yeah, there was a lot of schmoozing when it goes to that.
Music, though. She comes back from class every week, and she goes, "You got to see what we talked about in class."
Yeah, I'm always
That's how we got in touch with you, Jeff.
Yeah,
is because of Shireen.
Yeah,
Well,
so I enjoy that.
And if
we have a good
anybody
time.
tries to touch your class, there's going to be riots
How many
on
students
campus.
do you have in class?
Well, on a year basis right now, the average is somewhere between 800 and 900 total that take it. So that's between two face-to-face classes. There are approximately 300 in each face-to-face class between fall and spring. And then there are somewhere around 500 that take it online. But, there are cuts.
Sure.
So there
Do
are
you have a
things
TA?
going on.
I made the cut.
I have a grader.
You have a grader.
Yep.
Do they have to have any chops?
No, I don't.
Like a guitar tech? Or?
You know, you got to be able to keep secrets.
Exactly, because there's a lot of them.
Let me prepare you, Jeff, for what might be coming.
All right.
With an opening question. Why should we care about the history of rock and roll?
I think the best answer for that, straight up, is that it's the social history of the United States of America. I mean, if you, like, people, like, okay, Missoula is a lot more diverse now than it used to be. I think we can all admit
Correct.
that, and that's
Yep.
great. And I hope it becomes even more diverse as we, continue to live in this great community. The fact of the matter is, though, if you're talking about the history of rock and roll, you're basically talking about the acceptance of people that came into the United States from other cultures. And really, the thing I say in the beginning of the class is the history of rock and roll is about, a dark-skinned American, call him African-American, whatever you like, creating a style of music, a white person sort of piggybacking or hijacking or taking off on that and marketing it and selling it. And eventually people of color get the credit. But the cool thing
They
about
didn't get the credit back as you
they
did
did
back
not.
in those days. No, there's no credit to them.
You get credit if you paid for it, maybe if you sold part of your royalties, but that's why it's important, I think, is because it ends up teaching you about where this music really came from.
Well, there are a number of what is considered pure American music forms, right?
Yes.
And Africans came here with slave music in the 1600s, and then it melded into, a mixture of country and blues and gospel and jazz and boogie woogie. But the combination of all that, the elixir that had produced was rock and roll.
The combination of all of that produces rock and roll. That really one of the questions that I ask the students from day one, and I ask any audience that I do a sample lecture for is, even though people might consider me to be an expert on the topic, which we're all students, we continue to learn. I ask them, what is the history of rock and roll to you? Because like the cut that you just played, Arnie,
right?
That's in some ways where the history of rock and roll begins for you.
Sure.
For me, the history of rock and roll begins like with Men at Work.
Right.
Or actually Glenn Campbell crossover hits from country to pop.
Yeah, Wichita Lineman.
Right, exactly, or the Rhinestone Cowboy. But
That's why the class is so important, though.
Right, and where it begins to you is always an opinion, because what we're looking at right now is that the history of rock and roll generally, by most people that are writing textbooks, which I would estimate, in my opinion, are white males between the ages of 45 and 55, many of whom are college professors. They write from the perspective that Elvis is where the beginning is. But you know what? If you ask Quincy Jones, he says it's Louis Jordan.
Right.
And so even though it wasn't named rock and roll then, it was, jump jazz or jump blues. And so it's always an opinion.
To me, I always felt that rock and roll began, and I might be wrong about this completely, but I always felt when the piano was replaced by the electric guitar in the music.
I think that's really important because,
Because that's what drew teenagers into the music. And something about that electric guitar that really made a difference.
Well, part of it is just the distorted element. I mean, you can't really distort a piano. I mean, you can play a piano loudly. I mean, if anybody, distorted the piano, I suppose Jerry Lee Lewis did a little bit. Some people said that when he played the piano, he more like raped the piano, which sounds terrible to say, but
he banged. I mean, he just attacked.
He was killing it.
Yes,
I mean, he was first of all, he was standing on it. He was playing it, like with his leg, hanging over the end, and people that were like, say, Liberace fans or fans of, any pianist who was important at that time would look at him and say, how dare you attack this sacred instrument like that?
Right.
So when the guitar comes into play, first of all, you can't carry a piano around very easily, and God bless Elton John and Billy Joel and all those people, but it doesn't have the same effect as staring at the audience and pointing at them with this semi-phallic symbol,
right?
Which is another part.
And then when you hear, the sort of the gatekeepers of rock and roll music play the first. I remember when the first time I heard Jimi Hendrix, I said, "What is this?" I couldn't even believe it was a guitar.
Exactly.
The way he. He
and you heard him the first go round.
Wow, you are old over there. Whoa.
But I actually think that's a very interesting thing because it's reinterpreted and filtered through over the years. Like, I heard Jimi Hendrix in 1981 when I was 14 years old, and I was listening to
I heard him in 1967.
Jimi Hendrix, right. He heard him when he first came out.
Right.
And there are benchmarks like that. I remember, I listened to him, and then I remember hearing Eric Clapton do a guitar solo, and I said, where'd this guy come from?
Right.
That was the measure to some extent. Who could really, take the instrument and combine it with the, with the music, with the lyrics, and make it do something that hadn't happened before.
Well, I think, if there's a cut that we could play at some point is Rocket 88 by either Ike Turner or...
the original, and that was when Ike Turner was before he was with Tina Turner.
Yes, it was right. And it was the Ike Turner's band, and then I'm going to blank out on the name of the other guy there. I might have to pull my slides up. But they would play this song called Rocket 88, and when they originally recorded it, they were headed to the studio. And what happened was the speaker fell off of the top of their car on the way. And the speaker cone broke. And they had to fix the speaker cone. And the person that was doing this was the Sun Records owner. And Sam Phillips looks at this and he says, all right, we have to do the session, and this is your speaker for your guitar. And so they stuffed paper in the speaker cone, and it distorted it.
Right, and it's the first time that happened.
And that was the first. And so, when I play that song in my class, I always ask people, what instrument is this you're hearing? And then if someone will raise their hand, and they'll say, well, that's a saxophone.
I thought it was a saxophone.
So I'll tell you something interesting.
What was it?
And it ends up being electric guitar, distorted electric guitar, because of the way the speaker ended up. And
so as a kid growing up in New York City, we had a lot of radio stations. Many towns in the 50s and early 60s didn't have a lot of radio stations. And I remember distinctly on one of the stations, you would hear Chuck Berry, Bo Diddley, Fats Domino, Little Richard, and then you move down the dial, and all of a sudden it was all the non-African-American guys. You'd have Elvis and Buddy Holly and Richie Valens and Jerry Lee Lewis all on a different station doing the same thing. And in some cases, they were doing covers of the other guy's song.
Right.
In many cases, they were doing covers of the other guy's
So we
songs.
learn in History of Rock and Roll, Jeffrey Brandt.
Yeah. It was like radio stations, and this is a part where, again, there's always more research to be done. You have the railroad tracks kind of, down the center of the stereotypical area, in the United States. And on one side of the tracks, you have the poor folks living, which, many of which were probably people with dark skin. And you have the white folks, and the radio stations catered to those sides.
Sure.
Oftentimes, the radio stations for African Americans did not have as strong a signaling. They didn't have as funding that was as good. Kids that were white teenagers that wanted to investigate who the original artists were had to really dig to get that stuff. So when you're hearing, Arnie, the sort of the white artists on one side and on the turn the dial, and then you're hearing the African American artist, that was very true.
Well, I remember distinctly because as a kid, as a young kid, I was watching American Bandstand. I remember the first time Little Anthony and the Imperials was on the American
really?
You
Bandstand.
would love this class, Arnie. I'm telling you right now. And you two being from New York, Arnie and Scott, Tin Pan Alley. We learn about Tin Pan Alley.
Of
course.
Scott,
the Brill Building where they're all sitting around.
The Brill Building or the writing.
It's called Tin Pan Alley because of the tinny pianos.
Yep.
No, it make.
Let's do a quick ID. You're listening to What Do You Know? Our guest is Jeffrey Brandt, a professor at the university. And back to you.
So is rock and roll dead, dormant?
Come on.
I'm saying,
I'll answer that.
No. Or is it morphed? Is it morphed into other forms? I mean, it's gone through a transition. You wouldn't necessarily, say, or maybe you would, that I don't know, Drake is doing rock and roll.
Well, I mean,
Bruno Mars is the only one.
Bruno Mars is ripping off Prince. Is what's happening, and are doing a really good job of it.
His guitar solo was amazing.
He is amazing.
Hold on, answer the question.
Okay. I don't think so. I think this is, in my humble opinion, what I say in class is rock and roll will cease to be important or will cease to grow when it stops offending people.
Okay.
Because that was the whole thing in the beginning, was the parents or the status quo or, John Q. Public looks at what Elvis is doing, shaking his leg, and says that's inappropriate for kids to be, that's inappropriate for anybody.
So with this is what we talked about at the intro. Rock and roll is about rebellion. You're rebelling against something, okay? He asked the question, is Kiss rock and roll? I said, Kiss has adopted the style of rock and roll, but they didn't come at it from a place of rebellion, okay? But the New York Dolls,
I don't know.
and the Ramones came from a place of rebellion.
I'll agree with that.
Right? So, I mean, it's a place of rebellion. So that's why it'll never go away. As long as you have, hormones coursing through your body and blood going through your veins and kids feeling a certain way, they're going to be rebelling
and wanting to express it.
Yes.
Well, you made a point. Bruno Mars is bringing back a dormant piece of the rock and roll.
I think so.
And it's harkening back to the early days. Is there anybody else out there doing that?
Well, I mean, I think everybody's doing it actually since the Beatles broke up. I mean,
Really?
honestly, I
In
think
the
that
70s?
yes, because when the Beatles broke up,
68, actually.
when,
Well, I thought it was
the thing is like
1970 by the.
I'm amazing with dates, like in general, but in my class, I just go on my PowerPoint so much that
that
it's
the
like.
Beatles appeared in public live was in 1968.
Yeah,
It's
but
true.
the last when they
It's
broke
true,
up
but they
was
technically
1970.
broke up was in the 70s.
Yeah.
Right,
So
right.
thank
Okay,
you,
we're
Arnie.
both right.
Well, I think the thing is that the honest truth is that if you look at when the Beatles split, there was so much fragmentation in the industry in general. First of all, the bands themselves didn't have a clear leader to look to.
Right.
The radio stations were like, okay, well, what do we do now? There aren't going to be new hits by the Beatles coming out. And that is to some degree by coincidence, some degree probably population, some degree just formatting and changing in the business. Radio stations started to format and just play programming different.
Wouldn't a Stones fan, however, say the Stones kind of filled that gap a little bit?
Well, you as a Stones fan, honestly, you could actually argue the point that the Stones are more influential than the Beatles because who wants to, in my joke in class, is who wants to act like the Jonas Brothers?
Right.
They're a bunch of goody two-shoes, and that's what the Beatles ended up kind of looking like. The Rolling Stones, right? And even though they don't look scruffy now, like when you look back at them, they were very scruffy then. It was quite what we think of as disheveled.
You got to remember when Ed Sullivan had the Beatles on in '64. Parents would just say, "Look at those guys! They got that long hair." And then they saw the Rolling Stones.
I know,
and the Beatles looked good in comparison. They were wearing ties and they had suits on. The Rolling Stones were a lot more scruffy than.
Well, let's
those
ask.
guys.
What's nice about the room we have here is we have different generations being represented.
Right.
Arnie's obviously the oldest
The
in the
oldest.
room, but he was there at the beginning.
I love it.
I think I'm a little older than you. I'm 50. How old are you?
I'm 30.
Yeah,
I'm
he looks
kidding.
like 30.
I'm 45.
You're 45. This gal here is,
In her
28.
her late
She's
20s.
26,
teens.
So
24.
Let's throw it around the table. So Arnie identified the moment of when rock and roll really hit him.
Right, yep.
The Beatles on Ed Sullivan, right?
Well, the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, the British invasion,
Right.
and all of the early stuff. Because we had the advantage in New York of having
that is cool.
25 radio stations, and
Right.
you could listen around, and your parents couldn't keep you from turning the dial.
That
right?
is cool.
And the
So you can
history
listen to
there
it
was
all.
great.
So I would say that in this, so mine was the late 70s, and I got to be honest with you, I'm ashamed to say that it was more classic rock than it was actually the music of the times.
It's not your fault.
It's not my right. I was not hip enough.
Maybe
high
you're an
school.
old soul.
No, I wasn't
It's
hip
okay.
enough. No, the problem was that the record industry was marketing to me. They
Yeah.
were doing reissues.
It was formatting too.
Yeah, they were formatting and doing reissues of the Doors. It was that whole thing. And I didn't get. Then they had the Police and then the Clash and then the Sex Pistols. I discovered that later on. So,
But in the 70s, you also had, you had Janis Joplin and you had the Doors.
well,
and
that
all-
was the classic rock. The that kind of wave.
Well, and there's also psychedelic piece came in. That wasn't really as classic.
So I want to ask
The whole
Jeffrey
psychedelic.
what was his first kind of connection with rock and roll?
Well, my first true connection would, it's, again, we're always ashamed to say, aren't we, when we look back, but it was Glenn Campbell.
Yeah.
I mean, and I didn't
When you
even.
said that you
Lineman for
considered
the
him for
county.
rock and roll, I was like,
I was like-
love it.
and I was driving the main road.
Well, for me, it was Rhinestone Cowboy. I would just sing it for people if they wanted to hear it, and I don't remember all the lyrics. now.
Rhinestone Cowboy.
I grew up in Sitka, Alaska,
Wow.
but I have a lot of roots in the Midwest, so I think that's where that comes from.
How did that music get to you? TV, radio?
had a show.
LP,
He had a TV
LPs.
show. He had, he had.
He
TV
did
show.
briefly, but then he had some problems
That
with
was the early
cocaine and
70s.
whatnot.
Yeah.
And
Right, totally.
Well, he had, Galveston. He had a whole string of hits.
he had huge hits. He was He was the first crossover country pop star, and that's why I liked him. But
Yeah.
I didn't know that then. I just thought he
And who was
Right.
the writer?
Thought he was cool.
Wichita Lineman. It was what's his name? Wrote those songs.
he
for him.
he used tons of writers.
Right,
I
but
mean, there were.
he had the guy who wrote the MacArthur Park. I think wrote for him also.
Now you're taxing my memory. That's like
But Shireen, what was your first kind of interaction with rock and roll?
would be my sister's father was in a cover band called Hollow Point, and they were a Metallica cover band.
Nice.
And I'd have to sit and watch them when I was a kid. And so I just fell in love with just classic rock in general. So that was kind of my first thing of rock and roll. And Professor Brandt will tell you that he thinks that Metallica are basically the second coming of the Beatles.
I think they're the American Beatles.
You know, and when you said that, and Arnie will probably be able to attest to this, but when we were talking about Beatlemania, there's just nothing like it. Absolutely nothing like it.
I told him when I first heard on the radio, it wasn't on Ed Sullivan. When I first heard sitting in my room, I remember where I was, and somebody said, here's this new British group, the Beatles, and I heard She Loves You, which was the first song I ever heard. I said, what is this? I mean, I had never felt a reaction to music like that.
You get a high from it. It's cool.
Yeah. Okay,
so fresh.
I want to talk about consuming music. How did you consume music, right? Because that also changed. You were the radio, right?
Right, totally.
All about the radio, the New
and
York
then
radio.
Buying albums, record albums.
He turned on the New York rock and roll station, and his life was changed by rock and roll.
Of course it was. It always,
That's a Lou Reed song.
I know. I love it.
Well,
that's true.
You?
My life was changed. Well, LPs first, so long play records, 12-inch records, 33 RPMs, and then we had one radio station in town that played a real mix of country and a little bit of what would end up as classic rock.
Sure.
And then I went from LPs to CDs. I was one of those kids that skipped cassettes, skipped 8-tracks. I skipped all that. I went directly from LPs to CDs.
Really?
And
did you make cassettes of your LPs?
No, I just bought them. I
so were you just
repurchased
holding
them.
on to the primitive version and didn't want to go to tapes?
No, I wanted to go directly. I went from LP, and then I bought a CD player in the fall of 1986.
Okay.
And I directly started replacing my LPs that mattered to me with CDs.
Right.
But you never made a tape for portability?
Oh, I did make a tape for, because my Subaru had that. And so I had mixed tapes, quote unquote.
Now, how about you?
Oh, well,
Corrine.
of course, thank you, from 94.9 KISS FM. I did tapes and CDs, of course, my time, but being raised by my grandma, we had a lot of records, and I also had an 8-track player that had an old Elvis 8-track, and so
there you go.
Yeah, I had this 1977 Tornado.
I was LPs and 8-tracks. Because my parents had it in their car.
As you know, I just went and bought a record player again because I'm going down to my basement of my house.
Uh-oh.
I got cartons.
Here we go.
I got cartons of the old records.
Have you ever noticed they take a lot of space up?
Yes, they do.
And there's something that sounds a lot better created.
I didn't want to throw them out. I said, look, I got Paul Butterfield Blues Band.
That's true.
I can't throw this out.
You can find that on
Cooper with, Al Cooper performing.
Mike Bloomfield?
You can find that on iTunes.
Super Sessions? That's a
Peter,
great
Paul,
record.
and Mary for 1,000.
By the way, Arnie has a Chet Baker record.
Chet Baker is, but anyway, I want to ask you, Sharina, just a quick question. When you were in your formative years, listening to Metallica, whatever, did it affect what you wore and how you dressed? And I mean, did you really just get into that completely?
No, totally not. No.
What?
I wasn't. I was raised by my grandma, and so that was my sister's father. So my grandma was pretty old school. So no, it didn't affect anything like that. But she was very open to me listening to, stuff that I wanted to listen to, as long as it wasn't dirty.
I'll tell you one of the most.
It was all dirty.
You just want the M&M. Everything else was okay.
I'll tell you one of the most telling stories that I can share with you that I think would resonate with you. So I was in Russia. I had an office in Moscow, Russia, when MTV first came on the air. They had no Western programming. This is in the late 80s, early 90s.
Right.
And the first thing they allowed in was music because it didn't, in their minds, it was just music. It didn't have a political.
Right.
So they put, and I'll never forget, the first thing they had on was Madonna doing Like a Virgin
Oh, my
video.
gosh.
In Russia?
In Moscow. I can tell you that 2 days later, every Russian woman under 50 was dressed like Madonna in that video. They had dyed their hair. They had turned their hair. They all wanted to be Madonna.
Images,
it was like one of the
everything,
most shocking transformations I had ever seen. And that was, to me, showed the real power of the music.
So our guest is Jeffrey Brandt, professor at the University of Montana. He has the most popular course.
Yes, he does. History of rock and roll.
So tell us, what's the syllabus like? What's the kind of the progression? How do you start the class and,
Well,
kick it off with?
We start in the late 1800s because there's no way to technically know, where the blues really formatted. But we very quickly get to the 1940s and talk about jump blues, jump jazz, however you want to term that. And then we get into right around 1954, where most white people think that the rock and roll started. Really, rock and roll is the renaming of R&B music by DJ Alan Freed.
Right.
You know, he just said,
Was in 1951 where
Cleveland.
he started doing
But
it.
he was kind of known as a bad boy, though.
he was right. He was
You know?
kind of a
He and Murray the K. Kaufman were
Yep.
two of the guys that, you know, and I listened to Murray K. in New York because I wasn't listening to Cleveland music.
Right.
well.
In Cleveland.
So they rename rock and roll, and then so for many people that's the leaping off point is 1954, and you have Elvis doing his thing and surprising a bunch of people because he's doing these sexual moves, and then we go all the way to about 2010. So there are some things that we skip that some people don't like my text that I have, which is a fantastic text. It's called Think Rock. It's by Kevin J.H. Detmar, and even if you just want to read it just as a book, it's an interesting book to read. It really is.
We've been
But
reading.
you have to take it with a grain of salt because they don't talk about Southern rock. They skip some things for the sake of time. I mean, there is a section. I mean, when I first looked at this book, I'd used 3 other texts, and I opened it up, and the first thing I saw was Jessica Simpson, and I went, "Oh no,
Oh, no.
I don't know if I can actually do this." And I said, "Hang on a second. If I don't embrace what's in this book and don't get to understand it, there's no way I'm going to truly understand what the history is in the the span of time that they're trying to cover, what it means." And as soon as I understood how they were placing Jessica Simpson and Britney Spears in that, I was like, okay, we can do this.
Makes sense, yeah.
And
So
so,
the text cover, you know, sort of the Beach Boys and all of the
Yep.
California
Oh, yes.
music.
yep, I mean, it really covers pretty much everything from 1954 to present day. The exception is what they like to do, like with heavy metal, for example, is they like to talk about the first creators of the music, the people that were popular first, and then they stop. So believe it or not, Metallica is not, which is disappointing to me. They're not in the textbook.
Okay.
You have, Deep Purple, you have Led Zeppelin, you have Black Sabbath. And then they say everybody leads from that. And
So they talk about the roots of it.
Right.
talk about the roots.
I'll tell you something funny. When a kid going to public school in New York City, you'd have at lunchtime these debates about who is the best center fielder, Mickey Mantle, Duke Snyder,
Right.
or Willie Mays. We also had the same discussion. Who was a better, is the Beach Boys better than Little Anthony and the
Right.
We had those kinds of discussions because there were groups of kids who followed one genre of music.
Right.
As they still maybe do today, I don't know. And others had their strong roots.
Identity.
It was identity. Little Anthony and the Imperials and the New York kind of crowd that was Dion and the Belmonts and what do you call it?
Dion DiMucci.
Yeah, Dion DiMucci and guy did Carry Me.
Oh boy.
Anyway, there was a whole group of New York guys, and then the California.
So you had the East Coast, West Coast. Even then, you had the East Coast, West Coast.
Totally. There's no question about that.
Yeah, it was cool
So-
learning about the Beach Boys, though. I mean, with Pet Sounds and just the stuff that they did with
Well, that was
recording and
transformational.
Well, that was
whatnot.
amazing music.
It was,
Yeah,
that.
Good vibrations. I mean,
Well,
remember.
And Pet Sounds changed everything
Right.
in terms of the people wanting to listen to music and create music on a level where they knew that it was probably not performable at that time. And so that was really what inspired the Beatles to do Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which everybody listened to the Beatles, love them or hate them at that time, and which I don't think people probably really hated the Beatles unless they were adults and they really didn't like what was going on in that type of
there
music.
was big debate between the Rolling Stones and the Beatles.
Of course.
How to take your
But you had the Beatles leading the way then with, they used Pet Sounds from the Beach Boys as a leaping off point to making Sgt. Pepper, and then everybody went, wow, this can be done, and it can be, done in the studio. You maybe can't perform it yet, but this becomes art rock.
Right.
And then that, moves.
The first concept album.
Right, his first, important concept album. And, the Beach Boys hate to hear that. But
And they really transitioned themselves, the Beatles, from She Loves You to, Sgt. Pepper. To
They did.
some of the later stuff. And I think what people forget now, looking back, they really only had about a 4 or 5 year lifespan in terms of being, in the public eye, producing new music and new albums.
And being, right.
They hit in about 64, even though they began earlier. They hit in 64, and by 70, they were done.
Yep.
But it has had such an effect on the
Well, it had an effect on popular music in general, but when you start thinking about bands that influence other bands, that spawned other bands, the Beatles are not necessarily at the top of that list. It's the Rolling Stones.
The Rolling Stones.
Right? It's the Rolling Stones. It's some of the heavy metal bands. It's, of course, the Velvet Underground.
Velvet Underground. Yeah.
And Nico.
Right, but that's all.
Yeah.
I remember
those are
listening
things
to
that
heroin the first time.
There's a part of the book on Velvet Underground.
Yeah.
But the thing is talking about this. But one of the things I wanted to talk about is, so you're talking about your syllabus, you're talking about your student body, and people that are interested in it. What if people want to learn more? Where do they go after this class? Like, what's your recommendation?
Well, I mean, I always, when I used to do the class, and it was, before I should say, when I did the class, and it was a more involved sort of academically.
Yep.
It's a little bit simpler in terms of, getting the grade at this point in time, which may or may not be one of the reasons that it's very popular.
I like it. I'll take it. It is a very fun
It's
class.
an enjoyable subject.
But one of the things that I had people do is I had them do My Rock History, which was 3 categories of your most influential music. And so for some people it would be music that I fell to sleep, music that I would use to fall asleep to, music I listened to in my car, and music that I made out to my girlfriend, made out with my girlfriend to. I mean, seriously, it was anything. I had people.
Johnny Mathis.
I had people like submitting My Rock History as songs that I would strip to, songs that, I mean, it was
By the way,
crazy.
that's the record industry, because they couldn't figure out new ways to theme these
Right.
packages and these things, so they created the Lovers collection, the strolling on the beach collection, the whatever. So anyway, it's packaging. But my question for you is, so that they want to explore further, how about like other complementary curriculum, like the media arts program or the journalism program or the entertainment management program here? I mean, we have some strong companion, departments that someone could get a really well-rounded education, not just on rock and roll,
Right.
but on the music industry and the entertainment industry.
Well, entertainment management in general is like, in some ways, that, like, the history of rock and roll should be actually run from the business school.
Yeah.
In many
Well,
respects.
I talked to him about,
It's-
Scott is Jewish, and I talked to him about the Jewish immigrants. But I talked to him about the Jewish immigrants and just, that whole thing about them. And that's why they're so ingrained in the music
Yes.
industry.
Those are great writers.
And he knows that they are, and he knows that.
Well, like
It's very
Neil
true.
Diamond. And,
Yeah.
The business
among others.
industry.
Yes.
From Brooklyn.
Who was
Brooklyn
in the
and
same
Bronx.
high school choir as Barbara Streisand, by the
Oh,
way,
you
at
were.
her high school.
And Clive Davis.
Oh, and Clive Davis,
Right,
too?
yeah.
Yeah, they're all from Brooklyn. Everybody.
Well,
and
they are.
from Brooklyn.
That's true. I mean, even when I was in a rock band in Seattle, and people generally didn't like us in Seattle because we weren't a grunge band. We were
Right.
playing at the same time that Soundgarden and Pearl Jam were big, but we basically we got to have a chance to make it in the biz, and we went down to California and recorded. And we had a lawyer that was working in the entertainment business. His name was Jeff Ingber, and he was Neil Diamond's lawyer and Linda Ronstadt's lawyer, and he worked for Earth, Wind, and Fire and all these big people. And he took us under his wing, and he said, I think you guys are going to get a contract.
What year is this?
This is 96.
Okay.
And then 2 weeks after that, he died. And so we never got the contract. But the point was, one of the things he taught us that is so true is that people that are of Jewish descent oftentimes are controlling. I mean, they are in control of the entertainment business.
Oh, yeah. No.
And if you look at it, and I don't think it's a bad thing. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that you just look at the history.
Well, here's the thing.
It's true.
Go ahead.
I was going to say.
No, I was going to switch topics for.
Well, I was going to
Yeah,
say,
good.
before we end, I wanted to ask a question that
Go
I
ahead.
want to you and Scott.
Right.
Who is the fifth Beatle?
Murray the K.
Like this?
They don't
People
know.
say- no, they say it's Murray the K, but it's Ed. It's Ed. What's his name? There's first of all, wait a second. There are
wanna-
like 5 people that claim to be the fifth Beatle.
Right.
Who is
Well, yeah.
the real one?
Who is the fifth?
You mean who played with them?
The real
No,
Beatle?
there is a term
Yeah.
used in history texts.
And his isn't the only place
is
that I've heard.
who is the fifth Beatle? And I used to ask this a question.
Well,
but no, wait. Let's do it as a multiple choice.
I know
Okay.
I know the answer. I think Brian Epstein.
Okay, so
No.
let's do
No,
no.
it matters.
That's one of the choices. Is Brian Epstein,
Right.
and the second choice we'll just make it 3 choices. So
Right.
number 2 is Yoko Ono,
Right. No.
and number 3 is Sir George Martin.
Well, then it has to be George Martin. It can't be Yoko Ono.
Right, it's Sir George Martin. You can put it forth as.
He was the composer. And
Oh, he's the producer.
No, he's the
Yeah.
producer.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, he was a composer.
Who played
I,
with them.
I
You
just
know,
want to
he's
see
in
if
the
he
band.
is.
Well, you could say
Murray the K
Pete.
claimed to be the fifth.
But you could say Pete Best too, because he was
Pete
the first
Best.
drummer.
He was the first drummer.
Maybe the
I've heard
they're
Pete
not a
Best
drummer.
before, but George
Sir
Martin.
George Martin.
So let me
is.
do this because this show
I
can go
agree.
on for hours and hours. I want to throw out some names, and I just want to get your visceral reaction.
Uh-oh.
No. What's the names? Buffalo Springfield.
Buffalo Springfield. I mean, to me, it's just the leaping off point for Neil Young.
Right.
That's, I mean,
well, Stephen Stills too. I mean, look,
right.
For what it's worth, is now back as a popular song again.
It's
and
true.
its lyrics are as resonant today as they were before.
It was, for me, Buffalo Springfield was about Neil Young not being able to get along with people for one of the first times,
right.
and then moving on to another group where he couldn't get along with people.
Right.
So, which is cool.
We can't talk about music without saying Bob Dylan.
Bob Dylan, like, here's the thing about Bob Dylan I love to say is that Bob Dylan basically, he created the idea or convinced people of the idea that you didn't have to be able to be a good singer to be in the business.
Right.
And it's true. It's
right.
it's what you're doing is you're just selling your song or singing your song or selling your soul or however you want to say it to people in front of you to the best of your ability. And that's how I see Kurt Cobain. You know,
Right.
Kurt Cobain wouldn't have survived in a choir.
No.
You know, that wasn't about
no.
that. It was about
He couldn't have sung the Star Spangled Banner.
right. No way. Right.
It's Mariners game.
Exactly.
That wouldn't happen. Michael Jackson.
Michael Jackson to me represents a couple of things. One thing is that he's one of those child stars in the entertainment business that was lucky with timing and just MTV coming along and just the planets and the stars aligning to the point where everybody went, okay, we'll accept Michael Jackson as an adult in the rock and roll business. The same thing has happened to Justin Timberlake.
Right.
Yeah.
Who knows if it will to Justin Bieber? I mean,
It's hard to say.
It's hard to say.
Janis Joplin.
Okay, now this is my opinion on Janis, and not everybody likes it.
Right.
But I think Janis is incredibly important for feminism and for women and for rock and roll in a sense that she really could just shout and scream and just, for the longest time in the entertainment business, especially for white women, not necessarily blues singers like Bessie Smith and
Right.
You were supposed to quote unquote be pretty, and I'm not.
Doris Day. Look at me. I'm
Right, I'm
Sandra Dee.
Right, exactly. I'm this object on stage, and I'm going to sing pretty and look pretty, and then that's what it's supposed to be. She just went out there, and I'm not saying she wasn't attractive. She just went pow and just gave it to you. But I think Janis Joplin is partly important because she died at 27.
Right. Yeah.
I think that the 27s are.
That's why we want Justin Bieber to live forever.
Jim Morrison was 27. Jimi Hendrix was 27.
Yep. Robert Johnson was 27.
Beyonce.
I think Beyonce is another great example of I think feminism in action. She's like taken control of the business in terms of doing it the way she wants to do it. I don't see her at all like Mariah Carey in the sense of I'm a diva and everybody's got to follow my way. I think what Beyonce is, she's just a great individual that goes out there and she says, I want to do it like this. Let's try bringing people together this way. And maybe, I suppose she's demanding. I don't know her as a person, but I don't see her as nearly as demanding as the diva generation.
Let's do a quick ID. We're listening to What Do You Know? Our guest is Jeffrey Brandt from the university. Quick question. Have there been any controversial subjects where a dean or an administrator has said,
Iggy Pop's penis.
wow,
that's the best one.
Sorry.
Oh.
Has there anything been controversial?
Well, okay, there was one. Okay, there was one. So I had this. You talk.
Shot the photo by
the photo of Iggy Pop's penis.
Gerard Malangas took.
Okay, it is. It's a great photo. So this is what happened. You were asking about the syllabus earlier, and what I go through, and I didn't have a clause in the syllabus at all that rated the course in terms of it being rated R, restricted.
Right.
And now I do. And the reason I do is because one semester I was teaching the class and I looked up in the balcony. And the timing of this is absolutely impeccable in terms of it couldn't have been more wrong what this kid saw. But, the class is a little bit edgy in terms of language and all that because it's the history of rock and roll, And
how can you talk about it without talking?
You have to talk about profanity and, sex and drugs
drugs
and all of that. Well, anyhow, it's the punk lecture, which there might have been, at least in that text, it might have included the most profanity of all at that time.
Right.
And I'm just getting to the Iggy Pop slide, and I'm just letting it loose. And I turn to that slide, which is Iggy Pop standing there bare naked, everything's hanging out. And I look in the balcony, and there's a 3-year-old kid, maybe 3, probably 2, just staring at it. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I've scarred this kid for life. Well, that was my thing. I was like, what is the kid doing in the lecture? This is not for young children. And so
he was auditing the class.
Yeah. He was related to the president. I don't know. But what happened was from there on, I just said, I don't want you to bring your children to lectures. And I still have people that will say, well, my kids, they're exposed to this every day. Can I bring them? I'm like, no, they should be in school.
That picture get into the curriculum.
Well, I just put it on my slide because it was.
But it's not. But it's not a super popular photo.
No,
it's not. It's a red herring.
Okay, I mean the reason I put it in is because Iggy Pop was the guy that would, he would go
sex symbol.
But he would go into his shows and he would spread himself with peanut butter and spread himself with raw meat. He would just do weird stuff to do weird stuff.
Me.
Yeah.
As opposed to Ozzy Osbourne, who just bit the head off.
Well, that was because he was drinking so much.
I recommend the Jim Jarmusch Stooges documentary, which puts into context Iggy's and the Stooges.
Right. That sounds interesting.
However, the broken glass and the peanut butter was probably a handful of times, but that's what he's known for.
Right. Yep. Well, because it was so controversial.
It was, right.
Of these moments.
I mean, but there's also snippets in the history of music that you never forget. Like, I'll never forget the line from, and when with the song, heroin, it's my wife and it's my life.
Right.
That just resonates. I mean, that was just captured.
Powerful lyric.
That was the most powerful.
Did you do heroin after hearing that?
No, I'm just saying. But if you're working in drug treatment, what's a more powerful visual imagery of saying heroin? It's my wife and it's my life. That just capsulizes.
It is. Sorry, go.
I think that's a great point because, first of all, just to sum it up, what's lost with this generation because of exposure to everything due to the internet and all the great communication we have today is we're exposed to everything. Nothing shocks us anymore.
Right.
Then, if you had a song on the radio, you're talking the 50s or even the 40s that was suggestive, that talked about two people being in the room together, being close, that was enough to throw people off. So when people were talking about heroin, and Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground were speaking very directly to people about issues that were on the street.
Well, like Walk on the Wild Side.
Right.
We heard that on the radio.
Exactly. That was shocking. That would shock people.
And
it's not even shocking.
And I told Scott, I pulled over to the side of the road in 1973 when I heard Billy Joel singing Captain Jack and talking about sitting in his room masturbating.
Right.
I mean, you never heard that on a radio.
You would not hear that.
We got to take a break.
We got to take a break right now because you're listening to What Do You Know? On Newstalk KGVO, Jeffrey Brandt is our guest. Shireen Herrera's in the studio from KISS 94.9. And we'll be right back. Remember, we're presented by Don Maddox, Glacier Sotheby's International Realty. Back with our final segment after this. We are back.
So, Professor, who should we be listening to now based on your opinion of the industry?
Like right now?
Right now. If I'm going to go out and do a Spotify list, who should I be listening to?
Well, I mean, here's what happens, what I do. I basically learn from the students. And one of the bands that I'm into right now is the 1975. And they're a British band. Their accent is so thick, they're a little bit hard to understand. Their first album I really like. I like pop music. I will readily admit that I'm a huge Katy Perry fan. I'm not saying
she's hard not to like, right? I mean, it's not offensive. She's very likable.
But to me, this is one of the things I say, and I know this maybe doesn't answer the question perfectly, but when people ask me, who should I check out? I say, well, have you listened to Metallica?
Right.
And there are a lot of people that really haven't listened to them. They don't know where to start with them. And I say, I'm not the biggest Metallica fan in the world, but I say start with the Black Album because it's right in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
You'll get used to their sound, and then you'll probably look back on what they did prior and look forward to some of the other things they did. And they're a really important band because they're the biggest band in metal. And they really changed the way the industry looked at metal because we had the hair metal 80s prior to that.
Right.
And then Metallica, they were in the 80s, but they changed the look back to just sort of come as you are.
Well, and don't forget to tell those people that are asking you that to put their headphones on and listen to Led Zeppelin's Whole Lot of Love.
There you go.
On and on, not.
Right.
Remember the first time I ever heard that? I'm sure you did.
Yeah.
And the music spun around, in
Great
stereo. It was
Great
fantastic engineering on that.
And production.
Well, I also like Coldplay. I think Coldplay is a really good band in terms of album orientation, and that's something that's different. I'll sound a little bit ancient to some of the listeners, maybe because people right now buy music the same way people bought music in the 50s.
Right.
They buy 2 songs or 1 song. In the 50s, if you bought an Elvis record, it had 2 songs on it, maybe 4. Okay. Right. And so what happens now is people say, well, I like Gwen Stefani. So they buy 2 Gwen Stefani hits and they listen to that. They don't necessarily buy the album and listen to it beginning to end. With Coldplay, they have some.
It's almost a concept
album. Right. You have got to almost listen to it beginning to end to understand how things fit together.
Well, that's very important because I remember even buying 45s. The flip sides were always a gem in many ways of getting a record and flipping it over and hearing the
B-side.
Yeah, the B-side of Rolling Stones' Satisfaction. You flip it over and on the other side is Honky Tonk Woman or something.
Right.
And it's sometimes better. Yeah.
Well, let me ask you a question. How do people find out more about the class? And what do you do when you're not teaching, by the way?
Well, I have a private studio. I'm building a new private studio here in the next probably 8 months. I teach private percussion lessons, and so I teach a few people around town. But I'm going to build that back up. So I'm going to have a soundproof room in my house, basically.
Wonderful. And how do people get in touch with you?
Through the university. You just go on the University of Montana music website, and you can find links to my name.
So it's Jeffrey Brandt. You have an email address there, a phone number, an office number. Because that's how I got in touch with you.
We don't have phones. They took phones away.
Oh, no!
That's actually been a long time. So you just email. I'm really good about checking email.
Let me ask you one last thing. Miles Teller in Whiplash. What kind of drum?
All right, so see, there are 3 famous drum solos. There's In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida.
Right.
There's Whiplash, or you want to say Wipeout.
Right.
Any of those type.
Right.
And then there is Sing Sing Sing, which was in the jazz era, but kind of like a rock and roll thing.
Right.
So what they are rhythmic pieces that people identify with.
Right.
So,
and how good was his version of that for being a drummer?
If you look at it from a technical standpoint, rock and roll drummers usually don't have the same chops that jazz drummers do.
Right.
But what rock and roll drummers do is they cut to the simplest form. Like I remember Alex Van Halen doing a solo in concert once, and he could have done a lot more complicated things, but it was in an arena.
Right.
And so, some people went out and got a beer, and then a few people listened to it, and it was powerful because it was simple and direct.
Right, and I think that's a very good point. If you go listen to Artie Shaw or somebody, playing the drums back from the 40s, it was a much more artistic interpretation of things.
Very much so.
Well, look, this has been an enlightening show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
I love it. I love the idea about learning about rock and roll.
Yeah, well, it's part of our life. It's our central nervous system.
It's part of our culture.
Right, that's true too.
Arnie, great show. Our guest was Jeffrey Brandt from the university teaching the rock and roll class. You are listening to What Do You Know? We'll be back next week. See you then.
Take care. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you for listening to What Do You Know?
I can't wait for the next show, Scott.
I'm excited too, Arnie. If you'd like to suggest a guest, send me an email at scottrichmond@townsquaremedia.com. We'll see you next week. And thanks for listening to Newstalk KGVO.